It was a calm afternoon at the cabin, the kind of quiet retreat that people from the city dreamed about when they wanted to escape the chaos of everyday life. Nestled in the woods, surrounded by tall pines and the occasional sound of chirping birds, the cabin stood as a symbol of peace, privacy, and quiet dignity. The man who owned the cabin had lived here for years, preferring the solitude and stillness over crowded neighborhoods or nosy neighbors. It was his safe place, a haven away from the demands of modern life. But peace rarely lasts forever. The first sign of trouble came not from the woods, but from the paved road that cut through the forest and eventually wound its way into the nearby gated neighborhood, a neighborhood run by one of the most controlling HOAs in the entire county. From the road came the sound of a car engine, unfamiliar and out of place in the usual silence. The car slowed as it approached the path leading to the cabin. Then it stopped. Inside the car sat a woman, her eyes sharp and suspicious, her demeanor tense and accusatory. She was known to everyone in the nearby HOA community as Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of rules that were often imagined, exaggerated, or invented on the spot. For years, she had made life difficult for her neighbors, filing complaints for the smallest things: grass cut too long, trash bins brought out a few minutes late, decorations she deemed unacceptable. Karen thrived on confrontation, on power, and most of all, on control. Her son, a quiet teenager, sat in the passenger seat. Unlike his mother, he wasn't confrontational. In fact, he often looked uncomfortable whenever she went on her crusades. Today was no different. He glanced nervously toward the cabin, sensing something that his mother seemed blind to, a presence, an aura of authority that didn't fit the story his mother always spun about rule breakers and violators. The boy's eyes widened as he spotted the man sitting calmly outside the cabin. He wasn't just relaxing in the forest, he was composed, deliberate, as though his presence itself carried weight. Even from a distance, the boy noticed the way the man sat straight-backed, his movements minimal, his gaze steady. He carried himself in a way that felt military. The boy whispered urgently to his mother, but she wasn't listening. Karen's attention was fixed entirely on the man. She immediately assumed the worst. To her, anyone living off the grid or outside the HOA's iron grip was suspicious, dangerous, and possibly even criminal. Without hesitation, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911, her voice sharp and breathless as she reported what she called a dangerous intruder at the edge of the community. She never once considered that she might be wrong. As Karen barked into the phone, her son's eyes locked on the scene unfolding just behind the cabin owner. Several men in uniform emerged from the tree line, their posture impeccable, their steps perfectly in sync. These weren't ordinary men. They wore the crisp, decorated uniforms of police officers or perhaps military police. Without hesitation, they raised their hands in a sharp, practiced salute toward the man at the table. Karen froze, lowering her phone for a moment, her words stumbling. She could hardly process what she was seeing. Her son tugged at her sleeve, whispering again, but louder this time, that the man wasn't just some random stranger. He was someone important. Someone commanding respect. And then it happened. One of the officers, standing tall and firm, spoke with conviction that carried through the clearing. "Yes, Major General," he declared, his voice ringing with both respect and obedience. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Karen's mouth went dry. Her son stared in awe. The man they had assumed was a threat, a criminal, hiding in the woods, was in fact a decorated Major General. The reality of what she had just done began to sink in. She had called 911 on a man of rank, authority, and influence. Not just any man, someone the uniformed officers clearly revered and respected. But Karen wasn't ready to admit her mistake. She never was. In her mind, there had to be an explanation that made her right. There had to be a reason why a Major General would be living in a cabin so close to her HOA community. She convinced herself that it was suspicious, that he must be hiding something, that the officers were somehow in on it. She straightened in her seat, determination hardening her expression. If anything, this only gave her more reason to investigate, to meddle, to dig into business that wasn't hers. She would not let go. The Major General, however, sat silently at his table, sipping his tea as though nothing had happened. His calmness wasn't ignorance, it was authority. He didn't need to explain himself to Karen. The salute from the officers had said everything. His presence demanded respect, and he had it. From everyone but her. Karen's son, still shaken, glanced back at his mother. He could see where this was heading, and it terrified him. She wasn't going to back down. If anything, she was just getting started. The forest grew quiet again, but it wasn't peaceful anymore. A storm was brewing, and it had nothing to do with the weather. Karen had crossed a line she didn't even understand. And the consequences of her mistake were only beginning to unfold. The stage was set. The conflict was no longer about HOA rules, or imagined violations, or a nosy neighbor peeking where she didn't belong. This was bigger, much bigger. And Karen had no idea just how dangerous the game she had entered would become. The calm before the storm had ended, the police officers who had saluted the Major General quickly dispersed into the tree line, leaving the cabin as quiet as before. To an outsider, it might have seemed as though nothing unusual had happened. The man continued to sit calmly at his table, his cup of tea untouched, his gaze distant. Deliberate. But for Karen, the moment had already set her on edge. She had witnessed something she could not explain, something that challenged her rigid view of authority and control. Most people would have backed off then. They would have recognized the situation for what it was and realized they had made a mistake. But Karen was not most people. Her pride, her need for control, and her obsession with enforcing rules she had no real claim over burned hotter than her fear. In her mind, the salute and the respectful title, Major General, were not proof of the man's innocence or integrity. Instead, they became fuel for her paranoia. She convinced herself it was a cover-up, some kind of elaborate scheme, and she was determined to uncover the truth. The 911 call she had made still lingered in the air. Dispatch had assured her that officers were on their way, but Karen had already seen uniformed men saluting the man. That only deepened her suspicion. If these officers were already here, did that mean they were part of the same conspiracy? Was the Major General hiding something so big that even law enforcement was helping protect him? She twisted the narrative in her head until she felt justified in continuing. Her son, however, knew better. He sat quietly, stealing glances at the man outside the cabin. Something about him exuded calm strength, the kind of presence that didn't need loud words or force to command respect. The boy could feel it in his bones, this was not a man to be challenged lightly. But Karen didn't share his caution. She got out of the car, her posture stiff with righteous indignation, and marched toward the cabin fence. Her voice rose in sharp, accusatory tones as she began announcing herself, projecting her words into the air like an officer reading out charges. She demanded to know what he was doing there, who had authorized him to live in this location, and whether he had any right to occupy property so close to her HOA's jurisdiction. The Major General did not respond. His silence wasn't weakness, it was deliberate. He had endured far worse confrontations in his career than the screeching demands of a suburban enforcer. His calmness only made Karen more furious. Back at the road, her son fidgeted, torn between loyalty to his mother and the sinking realization that they were digging themselves into something far beyond HOA business. He thought back to the moment the officers had saluted. He replayed the words in his head, "Yes, Major General." It wasn't just a formality. It was reverence. And that meant his mother was picking a fight with someone whose authority stretched far beyond property rules and neighborhood disputes. Karen, however, thrived on escalation. She pulled out her phone again, this time recording video, narrating the scene for her HOA board as though she were catching a criminal red-handed. Her voice rose with self-importance as she described the man as a dangerous trespasser and a threat to community safety. She framed the entire situation as if she were the hero standing between order and chaos. The irony was that the real order, the discipline and respect embodied by the Major General, stood silently before her. Minutes later, the sound of sirens broke the air. A county sheriff's vehicle pulled into the dirt path, its lights flashing. Karen's face lit up with smug satisfaction. She believed this was her victory, her moment to expose the so-called intruder. She waved frantically, signaling the officers, eager to present her evidence. But as the sheriff stepped out of the car and saw who was seated calmly at the table, his demeanor changed instantly. His spine straightened, his hand rose to his brow, and he snapped into a salute. "Major General, sir," he said firmly. Karen froze, the recording still running on her phone. She could hardly believe what she was witnessing for the second time in the span of an hour. Another officer, this time a sheriff, was saluting the man. Had just accused of being a dangerous trespasser. The Major General gave a small nod, acknowledging the salute, but said nothing. The sheriff lowered his hand, turned to Karen, and his eyes narrowed as he recognized her. This wasn't the first time she had made a call like this. She had built a reputation in the county for wasting emergency resources on trivial disputes. But this time, she had gone too far. Karen felt her confidence slipping, but she forced herself to stand taller. She wasn't about to back down. Instead, she launched into a long explanation, weaving her suspicions into a story that painted the Major General as a threat. She pointed to his cabin, to the officers who had saluted him, and to the secrecy of his presence in the woods. To her, it was evidence of a hidden agenda. The sheriff listened politely, but his expression betrayed his disbelief. He had no patience for her theatrics, and the fact that she was questioning a man of such high rank only made the situation more absurd. Still, Karen was relentless. She didn't realize she was digging herself deeper into a hole that she couldn't climb out of. She believed that the louder she spoke, the more convincing she became. But in truth, every word only made her look more irrational. Her son stood behind her, wishing he could disappear. He could already sense what was coming next. His mother's stubbornness would turn this from a misunderstanding into a full-blown confrontation, one that would drag their entire HOA into a conflict they were unprepared to handle. The sheriff, exasperated, finally turned his attention back to the Major General. With quiet respect, he offered his assistance, though it was clear the general didn't need it. The Major General remained seated, his silence commanding more authority than Karen's loudest accusations ever could. Karen's face flushed with frustration. She didn't care about ranks, titles, or salutes. She only cared about control. And if she couldn't control the man in the cabin, she would escalate this fight to the highest level. In her mind, this wasn't the end of the battle. It was just the beginning. The sheriff's car eventually rolled back down the forest road, its lights no longer flashing. The situation, in his eyes, had been resolved. The Major General required no assistance, and the complaint was clearly unfounded. But Karen stood frozen, her phone still in hand, seething with indignation. To her, this was not a defeat, it was evidence of a deeper cover-up. She climbed back into her car, dragging her son with her. The boy sat quietly, staring out the window, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But Karen's mind was already spinning, constructing her next move. If the local authorities refused to act, then she would bring the matter before the HOA board. She had influence there, years of browbeating neighbors and inserting herself into every committee meeting had given her power. And this time, she intended to use it. By the time she reached the gates of her pristine community, Karen had already begun rehearsing her story. She would paint the Major General not as a man of honor, but as a shadowy figure whose presence threatened their way of life. She would play on the fears of her fellow board members, convincing them that the cabin in the woods posed a risk to property values, to safety, to the community's reputation. The next evening, the HOA board convened in the community center. Karen wasted no time taking control of the meeting. With dramatic gestures and a voice that quavered with feigned urgency, she recounted her harrowing encounter with the man at the cabin. She spoke of uniformed men appearing from the woods, of salutes exchanged, of the sheriff's silence. She twisted every detail to support her narrative, that something secretive and dangerous was being hidden just beyond their gates. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Most of them knew Karen's history of exaggeration, but her intensity was difficult to ignore. Some were skeptical, but others, fearful of anything that might disrupt their tightly controlled neighborhood, began to murmur in agreement. Karen pressed her advantage, declaring that the HOA had a responsibility to investigate, to protect the integrity of their community. Her son sat at the back of the room, watching in dismay as his mother rallied the group. He wanted to speak up, to remind them of what had really happened, but his voice would never outweigh hers. Karen had perfected the art of manipulation. She thrived on fear, and the HOA board was her captive audience. By the end of the night, a motion had been passed. The HOA would draft a formal letter of inquiry, demanding that the Major General disclose his activities, his authority to occupy the cabin, and the nature of the uniformed men spotted in the woods. Karen's smug smile said it all. She believed she had won the first round of her war. But the letter, once delivered, did not receive the response Karen expected. Days later, the envelope returned. It wasn't a letter, it was a summons. A crisp, official notice stamped with military insignia and sealed with authority. The contents were brief and direct: the HOA had no jurisdiction over federal property, and the cabin, along with the surrounding land, fell under direct military protection. Any further harassment or interference would be treated as obstruction of official duty. Karen's smile faltered when she read those words. But her pride refused to yield. She brought the letter to the next HOA meeting, holding it aloft as proof not of the general's authority, but of his supposed secrecy. She claimed it was a tactic to intimidate them, to silence concerned citizens. Her voice grew sharper as she insisted that the very formality of the notice proved her point. Why else would such lengths be taken if there wasn't something sinister to hide? The board was divided. Some were beginning to see the folly in Karen's obsession, but others, swept up in her paranoia, rallied behind her. They whispered of surveillance, of hidden operations in the woods, of threats to their families. What began as a simple misunderstanding now spiraled into hysteria. Meanwhile, the Major General remained silent. His days passed in quiet routine, his presence in the cabin steady and unshaken. He didn't need to defend himself against wild accusations. His authority was established in ways Karen could never comprehend. Every time uniformed men passed through the woods, every time a vehicle bearing military plates parked discreetly near the cabin, it only deepened the air of mystery around him. To Karen, these were signs of a cover-up. To her son, they were proof that his mother was in way over her head. As weeks went by, Karen escalated her campaign. She began organizing late-night meetings with sympathetic neighbors, urging them to file complaints, to flood county offices with calls demanding transparency. She drafted petitions, plastered flyers, and even hinted that she would take her case to the press. Her obsession consumed her, and the HOA community fractured under the weight of her crusade. But the Major General was not blind to her antics. From his cabin, he observed quietly, his patience deliberate. He had dealt with far greater threats in his career than an overzealous homeowner. Yet even he knew there was a line that could not be crossed, a point at which silence would no longer be enough. Karen, oblivious to the dangers she was stirring, marched steadily toward that line. The storm she had unleashed was no longer confined to HOA politics. It was growing larger, creeping beyond the gates of her neighborhood, attracting attention she never anticipated. And soon, she would realize that some battles were not hers to fight, and some opponents were far more powerful than any HOA board could ever imagine. The woods were watching. The cabin stood firm. And the Major General. For now, weighted by now, the HOA community was fractured into two camps. On one side stood those who had grown weary of Karen's endless crusades. They saw her obsession with the cabin and the Major General as just another example of her meddling, no different from her years of nitpicking trash bins and lawn heights. But on the other side stood her loyal supporters, whipped into paranoia by her fiery rhetoric. Karen had never wielded such influence before. What began as whispers in living rooms now spread into organized gatherings. Flyers accusing the Major General of secret military experiments and illegitimate land occupation circulated through mailboxes. Late-night posts flooded the HOA's online forum, claiming strange noises in the woods, flickering lights near the cabin, and shadowy figures moving at dawn. Most of these stories were fabrications or exaggerations, but Karen presented them as evidence of a looming danger. Her son watched all of this unfold with growing dread. He had seen the truth with his own eyes, the officers saluting, the sheriff showing respect, the calm presence of the man at the cabin. But his words carried no weight against his mother's relentless conviction. Each time he tried to speak reason, she silenced him with the sharp finality of someone who could never be wrong. The tipping point came when Karen decided to escalate her campaign beyond HOA walls. She reached out to a local reporter known for sensationalist headlines and fear-driven stories. Within days, an article appeared online. Mysterious figure hides in cabin near gated community, residents demand answers. The piece was filled with Karen's quotes, her warnings of secrecy and danger, her insistence that the community was at risk. The journalist, eager for clicks, published every word without verifying the claims. And just like that, the quiet forest cabin became the subject of public speculation. No shouting could overcome. And then, as before, the salute came. Sharp, synchronized, unmistakable. Every uniformed man turned toward the cabin, saluting the Major General with unwavering respect. The clearing fell silent. Karen's live stream captured it all. Thousands watched as her narrative crumbled in real time. The man she had accused of being a criminal, a trespasser, a threat, was revealed, once again, as someone of authority, someone beyond reproach. But Karen refused to yield. Even as comments flooded her live feed, mocking her accusations and questioning her credibility, she doubled down. She claimed the salute was staged, the uniforms were props, the entire operation a ruse. Her stubbornness was laid bare for all to see, but she didn't care. To admit defeat would be to destroy the identity she had built as the community's self-appointed enforcer. Her son stood at the edge of the crowd, his face pale with shame. He wanted to disappear, to escape the madness that his mother had unleashed. But deep inside, he knew it was too late. This was no longer a neighborhood squabble. Karen had drawn national attention to a man who lived deliberately in the shadows of peace. And soon, the forces she had provoked would respond in ways she could never have anticipated. The protesters eventually dispersed, unsettled by what they had seen. The woods grew quiet once more, but the tension lingered. Karen returned home, her face hard with determination. She told herself this was just another battle in a long war. She believed she was exposing something monumental, something worth the ridicule and the resistance. But the truth was far simpler, and far more dangerous. Karen had awakened a storm that would soon turn directly on her. The days following the protest were unlike anything the HOA community had ever experienced. What was once a pristine, orderly neighborhood now buzzed with tension. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion, conversations at mailboxes ended abruptly, and community forums erupted with bitter arguments. Karen's live stream had gone viral, but not in the way she hoped. Clips of her shouting, accusing, and doubling down against undeniable evidence of the Major General's authority circulated online. Strangers mocked her, dubbing her Cabin Karen and turning her confrontation into a running joke. The internet had stripped away her carefully constructed image of control, reducing her to a caricature. But Karen refused to see it that way. In her mind, the ridicule was proof of the conspiracy. She believed she had struck a nerve so deeply that powerful forces were trying to discredit her. The more she was mocked, the more convinced she became that she was right. Her son, however, could no longer ignore the collapse around them. At school, classmates whispered about his mother, showing him clips from the viral videos. Teachers offered pitying looks. He felt trapped between loyalty to his family and the crushing weight of humiliation. More than once, he considered sneaking away to the cabin, to speak to the Major General himself, to apologize for what his mother had done. But fear kept him frozen. Meanwhile, the HOA board faced mounting pressure. Residents demanded answers, not from the Major General, but from Karen. Why had she dragged the entire community into chaos? Why had she embarrassed them on a national stage? Meetings grew heated, and the once docile board found itself fractured by mistrust. Karen, of course, positioned herself as the victim. She claimed the ridicule was orchestrated, that the board was complicit in silencing her, that she alone was brave enough to stand up against the shadow in the woods. But the shadow was watching. At the cabin, the Major General remained unchanged. He did not speak, he did not rise to defend himself, and he did not strike back against Karen's endless accusations. His silence was his weapon. For men like him, authority did not require words, it emanated from presence alone. Yet even his patience had its limits. One morning, a letter arrived at the HOA office. Unlike Karen's flyers or online rants, this was not filled with speculation or paranoia. It was stamped with an official seal, the kind that could not be ignored. The letter was direct: continued harassment, trespassing, or attempts to interfere with federal jurisdiction would result in legal consequences, including charges of obstruction and defamation. The board fell silent as the letter was read aloud. The reality hit them all at once: this was no game. The Major General's presence was not a mystery to solve, but a fact to respect. Their suburban rules, their covenants and bylaws, had no power here. But Karen was unmoved. She dismissed the letter as intimidation. She told her supporters that they were being silenced by fear. Her obsession had consumed her so completely that she no longer saw reality. To her, the only truth was the one she invented. Her son, unable to bear it any longer, finally broke. Late one night, while Karen was drafting yet another rant for the HOA forum, he slipped out of the house and made his way to the forest road. The woods were dark, but he felt pulled toward the cabin, toward the man who had silently endured his mother's crusade. When he reached the clearing, he saw the Major General seated as always, his posture steady, his gaze fixed ahead. The boy felt his throat tighten. He wanted to apologize, to explain that he hadn't meant for things to go so far. But the words stuck in his chest. The Major General did not speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone told the boy that he understood, that no apology was necessary. For a brief moment, the boy felt a strange sense of peace, a calmness he had never felt under his mother's shadow. Then, from the tree line, uniformed men appeared once again. They saluted sharply, their respect unwavering. The boy stood frozen, watching the gesture, feeling the weight of it settle over him. For the first time, he realized the enormity of what his mother had been fighting against. This was not a man to be challenged, not a presence to be trifled with. He returned home shaken, but his resolve hardened. He knew his mother would not stop on her own. And if she didn't, the consequences would be devastating, not just for her, but for the entire community. The next morning, Karen announced her boldest plan yet. If the HOA and the sheriff's office would not act, then she would take her case directly to the media. Not just a local reporter, but national outlets. She boasted of interviews, of television segments, of exposing the so-called cover-up to the entire country. Her supporters cheered. Her detractors shook their heads. And her son felt the ground beneath him crumble. Because he knew what Karen did not: when you shine a spotlight on power you do not understand, the light does not reveal secrets. It reveals you. Karen's announcement sent shockwaves through the HOA community. The idea that their petty neighborhood drama would now become national news filled some with dread and others with excitement. Her loyal supporters envisioned her as a whistleblower exposing corruption, while her critics feared the humiliation of being dragged further into her obsession. But for Karen, this was the climax of her crusade. She spent days drafting statements, collecting evidence, and rehearsing her story in front of a mirror. She twisted every fact, every encounter, into proof of a sinister cover-up. The salutes, the sheriff's respect, even the official letters, all became part of her narrative that she alone had uncovered a dangerous secret. Her son watched helplessly as she prepared. He knew where this was heading. He had seen the truth in the forest, felt the weight of authority in the silence of the Major General. But nothing he said could sway her. She was locked in a battle with an opponent she didn't understand. The storm she had summoned was about to break. The next morning, Karen announced her boldest plan yet. If the HOA and the sheriff's office would not act, then she would take her case directly to the media. Not just a local reporter, but national outlets. She boasted of interviews, of television segments, of exposing the so-called cover-up to the entire country. Her supporters cheered. Her detractors shook their heads. And her son felt the ground beneath him crumble. Because he knew what Karen did not: when you shine a spotlight on power you do not understand, the light does not reveal secrets. It reveals you. The storm she had summoned was about to break. Karen's announcement sent shockwaves through the HOA community. The idea that their petty neighborhood drama would now become national news filled some with dread and others with excitement. Her loyal supporters envisioned her as a whistleblower exposing corruption, while her critics feared the humiliation of being dragged further into her obsession. But for Karen, this was the climax of her crusade. She spent days drafting statements, collecting evidence, and rehearsing her story in front of a mirror. She twisted every fact, every encounter, into proof of a sinister cover-up. The salutes, the sheriff's respect, even the official letters, all became part of her narrative that she alone had uncovered a dangerous secret. Her son watched helplessly as she prepared. He knew where this was heading. He had seen the truth in the forest, felt the weight of authority in the silence of the Major General. But nothing he said could sway her. She was locked in a battle with an opponent she didn't understand, and she was determined to win at any cost. The morning of her televised interview arrived. Karen was radiant with determination, dressed sharply, her voice steady with conviction. She looked into the camera and declared that a man of unknown authority was occupying land near their community, that military personnel were moving through the woods, and that the HOA